The English countryside in the autumn of 1943 was a sprawling, open-air arsenal. Airfields, carved from ancient farmland, were now home to the 8th Air Force's growing fleet of B-17 flying fortresses. These were not the pristine, gleaming ships of propaganda posters, they were war-weary machines, their aluminum skin stained by oil and exhaust, their interiors a labyrinth of wires, hydraulics, and the lingering smell of sweat, cordite, and fear. Each one was a masterpiece of industrial production, a complex ecosystem of 55,000 separate parts, reliant on a nervous system of over 30 miles of electrical wiring. It was within this hidden, chaotic web that a ghost was hiding. A flaw so subtle, so random, that it defied all logic and diagnosis. The crews called it the Gremlin. Its symptom was as terrifying as it was brief. During the critical, earth-shaking moment of takeoff, as the 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engine screamed at full war emergency power, the entire electrical system of a bomber could, without warning, go completely dead. For 2, 3, sometimes 4 agonizing seconds, the cockpit would fall silent. The Euro horizon would topple, the artificial horizon would spin wildly, the radios would go mute. In an instant, the pilots were flying blind, deaf, and disoriented, their aircraft, heavy with bombs and fuel, barely clinging to the air 100 feet off the ground. Then, as suddenly as it failed, power would return. The instruments would flicker back to life, the radios would crackle, and the crew would be left with nothing but pounding hearts and a cold, lingering dread. There were no crash investigations because there were no crashes. Just near misses. A bomber would veer dangerously towards another in formation, or sink alarmingly towards the trees at the end of the runway, only for the pilots to regain control at the last possible second. The official reports were a study in frustration. Intermittent electrical failure. Cause unknown. No replicable fault found. The top brass, focused on the daily carnage over Germany, dismissed it as pilot error, takeoff jitters, or the fault of inexperienced, overworked ground crews. The problem was a phantom, a rumor, a mess hall legend. But for the men who flew, it was a very real specter that haunted every mission's start. They would climb aboard, perform their checks, and pray that the Gremlin would not choose their plane, on this day, to reach out from the wires and kill them before they even saw the enemy. It was into this atmosphere of superstition and bureaucratic denial that a 24-year-old technical sergeant from Kansas named Walter Wally P. Jenkins was transferred. Jenkins was not an officer. He was not a degreed engineer. He was a product of the Depression, a tinkerer who had learned his trade not in a university, but in his father's auto repair shop, fixing everything from tractors to radios with an intuitive feel for machinery and a stubborn refusal to let a problem beat him. He was assigned to the 427th Bombardment Squadron at RAF Molesworth, a base where the Gremlin seemed particularly active. And from his first day, listening to the terrified, angry accounts of the returning crews, Wally Jenkins made the Gremlin his personal enemy. Sergeant Jenkins's world was the base's maintenance hangar, a cavernous, drafty building that smelled of high-octane fuel, sweat, and ozone from the crackle of arc welders. While officers debated strategy in heated map rooms, Jenkins presided over a kingdom of greasy parts, complex schematics, and a crew of mechanics who looked to him for answers. He was a quiet man, not given to outbursts, whose authority came not from rank but from a deep, unshakable competence. The Gremlin became his obsession. While others wrote off the electrical failures, Jenkins began a meticulous, almost forensic investigation. He started with the obvious: loose connections, corroded terminals, worn-out switches. He and his team would spend hours tracing circuits, their hands black with grease, using multimeters and their own intuition. They replaced generators, voltage regulators, and entire sections of wiring harness. For a few days, the problem would seem solved. Then, on a cold, damp morning, as a fully laden B-17 named Worry Bird began its takeoff roll, the Gremlin struck again. The pilots fought the dead controls, the massive plane slewing towards the edge of the runway before power miraculously returned, allowing them to lift off, shaken and furious. Jenkins was waiting for them when they landed. He didn't make excuses. He listened, his face a mask of concentration, as the pilot described the exact sequence: the engines at full power, the vibration, the sudden silence, the duration. It was always the same: takeoff power, intense vibration, a 2 to 4 second blackout. It never happened in flight. It never happened on the ground with the engines at idle. This was the key. The fault was tied to a specific, high-stress physical environment. Jenkins realized he was not looking for a broken component, but for an interaction. A conversation between the airframe's vibration and the electrical system that was going horribly wrong. He requested the maintenance logs for every B-17 that had experienced the fault. He spread the blueprints across a large wooden table, their edges curling in the damp air. He noticed a pattern, not in the components, but in the routing. A main power feeder cable, a thick, heavily insulated wire that carried the electrical lifeblood from the generators to the entire aircraft, was run along the main wing spar, right through a section of the fuselage that housed the engine mounts. This was standard design, a matter of efficient use of space. But Jenkins's mechanic's mind saw something else. He saw that this cable was clamped tightly to the airframe at regular intervals. And at one specific point, just behind the number 2 engine, it passed within a fraction of an inch of a bare, unpainted, structural bolt that secured the engine mount to the fuselage. In the calm of the hangar, with the engine still, there was no contact. It was perfectly safe. But Jenkins began to imagine the scene during takeoff. The 4 1,200 horsepower engines, each a contained earthquake, shaking the entire airframe with a violent, specific frequency. The massive propeller tips spinning at supersonic speeds, creating a harmonic vibration that could loosen rivets and fatigue metal. In that storm of vibration, what if the main power cable, held by its clamps, began to whip? What if its insulated covering, worn by thousands of hours of flight, flexed just enough for the bare copper wire inside to touch that unpainted, grounded engine mount bolt? It would be an instantaneous, dead short to ground. The entire electrical system would collapse. The circuit breakers would not pop fast enough to prevent it. The generators would be overwhelmed. And then, as the vibration pattern shifted slightly as the aircraft lifted off, the cable would whip back, breaking contact. Power would restore. Proving his theory required a gamble that would have given any commanding officer a heart attack. Jenkins needed to replicate the fault, to create the conditions for the short circuit on the ground. He selected a B-17 that had been particularly prone to the blackouts, a ship named Desperate Measures. With the permission of a skeptical but desperate flight commander, Jenkins and his crew prepared for a dangerous experiment. They towed the bomber to a remote, disused section of the runway, far from other aircraft and hangars. They chocked its wheels securely and tied its tail to a ground anchor. This was to be a static run-up, but unlike any other. Jenkins's plan was to run all 4 engines to takeoff power simultaneously, simulating the exact moment of maximum stress. The risk was immense. If the short circuit happened and caused a fire, or if the engines shook the plane loose from its restraints, they could destroy the aircraft and kill everyone nearby. Jenkins, armed with a clipboard and a stopwatch, positioned himself in the radio compartment, right near the suspected fault point. Another mechanic was in the cockpit, watching the instruments. A fire truck stood by, its crew tense. The order was given. One by one, the engines coughed into life, their deep-throated roar building into a deafening, skull-shaking cacophony. The entire airframe began to tremble, a living, shaking beast. Jenkins held onto a structural member, his teeth rattling. He watched the main power cable. It was vibrating, a blur of motion. The mechanic in the cockpit called out over the intercom, "Instruments green. All systems normal." They held the power for a minute. Nothing. Jenkins's heart sank. Had he been wrong? Was the Gremlin truly just a phantom? He was about to call off the test when he decided on one last, reckless act. He signaled the cockpit to momentarily reduce power and then slammed the throttles forward to full military power in a violent, abrupt surge. It was a brutal maneuver, one that put immense strain on the engines and airframe, but it mimicked the aggressive takeoff of a heavily laden bomber. The engines screamed. The vibration intensified into a jarring, violent shudder. Jenkins kept his eyes locked on the cable. And then he saw it. For a split second, a brilliant, blinding blue-white arc of electricity flashed where the cable passed the engine mount bolt. A sharp crack was audible even over the engine noise. Simultaneously, the mechanic in the cockpit yelled, "We've lost it. Complete electrical failure. Gyros are tumbling." Jenkins stared, his theory confirmed in a terrifying flash of light. The Gremlin was real. It was a demon of vibration and poor design, a ghost in the machine made terrifyingly tangible. He signaled to cut power. As the engines wound down, the electrical systems flickered back to life. The silence that followed was broken only by the ringing in their ears and the frantic voice from the cockpit. Jenkins had done it. He had not only found the Gremlin, he had looked it in the eye. Now, he had to kill it. Armed with definitive proof, Sergeant Jenkins prepared his report. It was not a formal, typed document from an officer, but a grease-smudged, handwritten account accompanied by a simple diagram drawn on graph paper. He detailed the exact location of the fault, the conditions that caused it, and the visual confirmation of the electrical arc. He presented it to his commanding officer, a major who had lost friends to near crashes and was willing to listen. The major was convinced, but he was a small cog in a vast military machine. The report went up the chain of command, from Molesworth to the 8th Air Force headquarters. And there, it met a wall of institutional inertia. The response from the senior engineering officers was a masterpiece of bureaucratic dismissal. The design of the B-17, they argued, had been signed off by the best minds at Boeing. Thousands of these aircraft flew every day. A single, unverified observation from a sergeant, based on a dangerous, unauthorized ground test, did not constitute evidence of a systemic flaw. They suggested the problem was isolated to desperate measures, blaming poor maintenance by Jenkins's own crew. They argued that rerouting a main power cable was a massive undertaking, requiring revised blueprints, new manufacturing jigs, and thousands of man-hours across every squadron, all for a fault that, in their view, caused exactly 0 confirmed losses. It was a classic case of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, while ignoring the terrifying reality that it was broke, just not in a way that showed up neatly in their loss statistics. Jenkins was furious. He wasn't fighting the Gremlin anymore, he was fighting the arrogance of a system that valued rank over results. He was ordered to cease his unsanctioned experiments. But the war did not care for bureaucracy. The near misses continued. At a base in Norfolk, a B-17 veered off the runway during a blackout, shearing off its landing gear and writing off the airframe. The crew survived, but the incident was officially attributed to pilot error. Jenkins heard about it through the mechanic's grapevine. It was the Gremlin's first confirmed kill, and it was covered up by paperwork. He decided to go around the chain of command. He began writing letters, not to generals, but to technical sergeants and crew chiefs at other 8th Air Force bases. He described the fault in simple, clear language, with his crude but effective diagram. He explained the fix, a simple, thick rubber grommet, or even a wrap of electrical tape, to insulate the cable from the bolt. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a field fix that could be done in 10 minutes by any crew chief. These letters, passed from hand to hand, became known as Jenkins Bulletins. They spread through the enlisted ranks like wildfire. Crew chiefs, who lived and breathed with these aircraft, who trusted their instincts over a blueprint, began implementing the fix. They didn't ask for permission. They saw the worn insulation, they saw the proximity to the bolt, and Jenkins' theory made perfect sense. It was a quiet, grassroots rebellion against a hidden killer. They used whatever they had: strips of inner tube, leather pads, extra layers of insulation tape. The Gremlin's hauntings began. The incident that finally broke the bureaucratic dam occurred not at Molesworth, but at RAF Thorpe Abbotts, home of the 100th Bomb Group. On a crisp morning in November 1943, AB-17F, named My Prayer, was leading the group's formation on a maximum-effort mission to Bremen. The aircraft was heavy, loaded with fuel and a full bomb load. As it reached the critical point of its takeoff roll, the Gremlin struck. The electrical system died. The pilot, Captain John Jack K. Roberts, and his co-pilot were suddenly flying blind. The plane, deprived of its artificial horizon and directional gyro, began a slow, insidious roll to the left. With the runway ending and trees looming, Roberts fought the controls by instinct alone. But without instruments, his sense of balance was deceived. He was in a graveyard spiral, just feet above the ground. Behind him, 30 other B-17s were in various stages of their takeoff roll. A crash would be catastrophic, blocking the runway and likely causing a chain reaction disaster that would wipe out the mission before it began. By a sheer, miraculous act of instinct, Roberts caught the roll at the last second and managed to keep the aircraft airborne, muscling it into a shallow, wobbly climb. Power returned after 3 seconds, but the damage was done. They were off course, low, and alone. As they struggled to regain their bearings, they were jumped by a roving German Junkers Ju-88 fighter that had been stalking the English coast, looking for just such a straggler. The attack was swift and brutal. The Ju-88's cannons ripped into the still-climbing fortress, killing the radio operator and wounding the top turret gunner. Only the desperate, evasive maneuvering of Roberts and the accurate return fire from the waist gunners drove the attacker off. My Prayer aborted the mission, jettisoned its bombs into the channel, and limped back to Thorpe Abbotts on 2 faltering engines. The aircraft was a wreck. The mission was a failure. And this time, the cause could not be buried. The near collision on takeoff had been witnessed by the entire control tower and the following bombers. The subsequent attack was logged in official combat reports. Captain Roberts, a respected and decorated pilot, was livid. In his debriefing, he didn't blame the enemy fighter, he blamed the electrical failure. He stood before his group commander and gave a blistering account of the blackout, describing it in the same detail that Jenkins had documented. A staff officer, who had seen one of Jenkins' bulletins, made the connection. The report from Thorpe Abbotts, now bearing the weight of a combat loss and a decorated pilot's testimony, shot up to 8th Air Force Headquarters with a new, urgent cover sheet. The phrase, previously identified systemic fault, was used. The engineering officers who had dismissed Jenkins were now on the defensive. A formal inquiry was ordered. Jenkins was summoned to headquarters to present his findings. The inquiry room was filled with officers whose rank insignia glittered in the dim light. Jenkins stood before them, his sergeant's stripes feeling insignificant against the wall of brass. But he was not the same man who had submitted the first report. He was now a field expert, backed by the silent, grateful consensus of 100 crew chiefs across East Anglia. He presented his evidence calmly, his original diagram, the logs of the near misses, the testimony from Thorpe Abbotts, and the simple, undeniable logic of his fix. He had even brought a section of the power cable and a sample of the rubber grommet. He held it up. "This, sirs," he said, his voice steady, "costs less than a penny. It takes one man 10 minutes to install. And according to the reports from the squadrons that have implemented the field fix, it has a 100% success rate." The senior engineers from Wright Field argued back, presenting complex load-bearing calculations and vibration analysis charts that, in theory, proved the cable should not make contact. Jenkins listened patiently. When they finished, he asked one simple question. "With all due respect, sirs, have you ever been in AB-17 at full war emergency power on a cold morning?" The room fell silent. The theoretical world of blueprints and calculations had collided with the gritty, vibrating, unpredictable reality of combat aviation. The officers who had seen their friends nearly die, the commanders who needed every bomber in the air, outvoted the engineers. The decision was made. A high-priority technical order, 201B-17-243, was drafted and transmitted to every 8th Air Force base, and later to every B-17 unit worldwide. It was not a complex redesign. It was Jenkins' fix. The order mandated the inspection of the main power feeder cable at the No. 2 engine mount on every B-17. Where or close proximity was found, crews were to install a specified rubber grommet to provide a guaranteed insulating barrier. The effect was immediate and profound. The Gremlin vanished. The spate of unexplained takeoff blackouts ceased. The mess hall legends were replaced with a new story, the story of the sergeant from Kansas who had seen what the engineers could not. Jenkins was not promoted. He was not given a medal. His reward was more visceral. It was in the nods from pilots who now clapped him on the back instead of glaring at him in accusation. It was in the sound of a full squadron of B-17s taking off, one after another, their climb steady and true, their electrical systems humming with life. He had won his private war. The true impact of Technical Order 243 was not measured in the absence of crashes, but in the silent, cumulative preservation of force. In the brutal arithmetic of aerial warfare, every bomber that returned from a mission was an asset that could fight again. Every crew that survived was a repository of hard-won experience. Before Jenkins' fix, the Gremlin had been imposing a hidden tax on the 8th Air Force. It was eroding morale, consuming thousands of man-hours in fruitless diagnostics, and, most critically, it was randomly removing bombers from the order of battle before they even reached the enemy. Consider the math: if the Gremlin caused even one bomber in 50 to abort its mission due to damage or trauma from a near crash, that was 2% of the force neutralized by a friendly flaw. On a 500-bomber raid, that was 10 aircraft, 100 highly trained airmen, lost before crossing the English Channel. Over the course of the months it took to identify and fix the problem, this hidden attrition was substantial. But now, with the fix applied across the entire command, that attrition ceased. The effect was like giving the 8th Air Force a blood transfusion. The number of bombers successfully forming up and proceeding to target increased. The loss rates, when calculated against the number of bombers that reached enemy territory, began to show a slight but statistically significant improvement. Operational researchers, analyzing the data, noted the change but attributed it to better training or improved German defenses. They had no Category 4, saved from self-destruction. The salvation was invisible in the broad statistics, but profoundly real on the flight line. The fix also had a second-order effect on crew confidence. Pilots no longer had to wrestle with a latent fear of their own aircraft during the most dangerous phase of flight. They could focus entirely on the complex task of formation flying and the impending flak over the target, rather than dreading a sudden, inexplicable instrument failure. This slight edge in confidence, multiplied across thousands of crews, translated into slightly better formation discipline, slightly more accurate bombing runs, and a slightly higher chance of survival. Furthermore, the bombers that were saved from crashing on takeoff went on to fly not just one, but many more missions. A single B-17, over its lifetime, could fly 50, 60, or even 70 sorties. By preventing the loss of just one aircraft, Jenkins' fix was preserving hundreds of future sorties, thousands of tons of bombs dropped on German industry, and the lives of the 10 men aboard for dozens of missions to come. The useless wiring fix was, in fact, one of the most force-multiplying modifications. The story of the Gremlin and its fix did not end with the B-17. The technical order and the incident report from My Prayer found their way to the desks of engineers at other commands and for other aircraft. The B-24 Liberator, with its own unique and complex electrical system, was found to have a similar, though less frequent, issue with wiring chafing against airframe components under high vibration. A preemptive inspection and modification program was initiated, likely preventing its own series of incidents. More importantly, the philosophy of design changed. The Jenkins principle, that vibration and wiring were mortal enemies, was incorporated into new aircraft designs like the B-29 Superfortress. Wiring was given more clearance, better clamping, and improved insulation from the start. A lesson written in the near loss of My Prayer was now being baked into the blueprints of the next generation of bombers. For the ground crews, Jenkins became a folk hero. He represented the power of the enlisted man's practical knowledge over the theoretical knowledge of the officer corps. His story was told and retold, encouraging other sergeants and crew chiefs to trust their instincts, to question official dogma, and to pursue fixes for other, minor, problems that the higher-ups ignored. This led to a wave of small but critical field modifications across the 8th Air Force, improved gun sights, better heating in the waist positions, more secure oxygen line connections, that collectively saved lives and improved effectiveness. The war effort was advanced not just by grand strategy, but by 10,000 small acts of ingenuity from the bottom up. Jenkins himself was eventually recognized, not with a Distinguished Service Medal, but with a Bronze Star for meritorious service in a combat zone, a citation that vaguely alluded to his persistent efforts to improve aircraft safety. To understand the scale of what was saved, one must consider the brutal economics of the bomber offensive. The 8th Air Force suffered over 47,000 casualties, including more than 26,000 dead. It was a war of attrition where success was measured in fractions of a percent. In this context, the loss of even a few dozen aircraft to a design flaw was a catastrophe. Historians later estimated that the Gremlin, if left unfixed, could have been responsible for the loss of between 50 to 100 B-17s over the course of 1943 to 44 through direct crashes, mission aborts leading to easy enemy kills, and the cumulative drain on resources. Let us take the conservative number, 50 aircraft. 50 B-17s represented 500 airmen. It represented the explosive power of 1,250 tons of bombs that would never fall on German factories. It represented the industrial output of a city, the raw materials, the thousands of work hours, all wasted. By identifying and eliminating the Gremlin, Jenkins and the crew chiefs who followed his lead effectively added the equivalent of 5 full squadrons back to the Allied order of battle. These were not new planes rolling off the production line, these were veteran aircraft with experienced crews, a priceless asset. The impact of those 50 saved bombers rippled through the war economy. It meant that replacement aircraft could be sent to the Pacific or to other units. It meant that the German war machine felt the pressure of 1,250 more tons of bombs. It meant that 500 more American families did not receive a telegram beginning with, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret." And this is a conservative estimate. The true number of aircraft and men saved by the simple act of insulating a wire from a bolt is likely far higher, lost in the counterfactual fog of history. How many missions were completed because a bomber didn't abort? How many German fighters were shot down by gunners on a plane that didn't crash on takeoff? How many targets were destroyed by a plane that was able to fly its full tour? The chain of causality, started by one sergeant's fix, is infinite and unquantifiable. It stands as a profound testament to a fundamental truth of warfare, that grand strategies and technological marvels are ultimately dependent on the integrity of the smallest, most mundane components. The course of the war could be altered not just in the war room, but in the choice of a rubber grommet. The story of Technical Sergeant Jenkins is the story of the unsung engine of victory, the enlisted technician. It is a reminder that history is not only shaped by the decisions of commanders, but by the quiet competence of those who turn the wrenches, who read the gauges, and who refuse to accept good enough when lives are on the line. The Gremlin was a problem that existed in the blind spot between design and reality, a gap that could only be bridged by hands-on experience and stubborn perseverance. Jenkins did not have the authority to command a change, so he used the power of persuasion and the weight of evidence. He fought not with a gun, but with logic and a profound sense of responsibility for the men who flew the machines he maintained. His legacy is embedded in the safety protocols of modern aviation, where the lessons of vibration analysis and wire chafing are now fundamental principles. His story is a case study in the importance of listening to the voice of the operator, of valuing practical knowledge as highly as theoretical knowledge. In the end, the tale of the useless wiring fix is a story about the power of one sergeant, one idea, one simple solution. In the vast, mechanized horror of World War II, it is easy to see individuals as cogs in a great machine. But Walter P. Jenkins proved that a single cog, if it refuses to grind improperly, can prevent the entire machine from seizing. He saved not 300 bombers from a single, fiery catastrophe, but perhaps 300 potential catastrophes from ever happening. He saved crews to fly again, bombers to fight again, and families to be whole again. He is a ghost in the positive statistics of the air war, his name unrecorded in the grand narratives, his contribution known only to a few who were there. But for the